Hello. I am so pleased to welcome, is it too loud? Okay. I'm so pleased to welcome everyone here to see Jim Gerstein deliver the 6th annual Art and Mary Schumann Lecture, Making Sense of the Jewish Vote. My name is Bob Erlewine. I am a professor of religious studies in the Department of History and Philosophy, and I am the director of the Eastern Michigan University Center for Jewish Studies. I'd like to thank Engage at EMU for co-sponsoring this event with us, and I would like to thank the Foundation for their fundraising efforts on our behalf. Without their efforts, and of course support, and the support of members of the Southeast Michigan community and beyond, events like this would not be possible. Before going any further, I'd like to quickly take care of a bit of housekeeping business. My student assistant, Theodore, Theodore, it has the sign-in sheets. The sign-in sheets you can see are over there. So if you are an undergraduate looking for LBC credit or extra credit for a class that was granting it, or both, please make sure you sign in and give your EID and that sort of thing. And if you haven't done that yet, please make sure to do that before you leave. For our community members, we would also really appreciate it if you would sign in. You don't need to give your EID. You don't even need to have an EID. But if you could sign in, it just helps us with our kind of records and planning and publicizing. If you're okay with that, if you're not, we won't contact you. There's a place to indicate that. Also, if you're a community member, we have parking validations, so please come see me after the presentation, and I'll make sure you get it. I do want to call attention to the center's next event, which will be taking place at 7 p.m. on October 28th in this very room. Ann Arbor native and EMU alum, Professor Barry Stiefel will deliver a talk, Difficult Memorials, Historic Synagogues from the Days of Slavery, and it will be in this very room at 7 p.m. Okay, now, before introducing our speaker, I want to say a few words about Art and Mary Schumann, for whom this annual lecture is named. In addition to sponsoring this lecture series, they have been on the center's advisory board since its inception, at least as far back as 2012, and their generosity with their time and their resources has made our move to the new office space in Halley Library possible. By the way, if you have not seen it, I would strongly encourage you to stop by. There's a wonderful plaque there honoring the contributions of Art and Mary, and you should see the new space. Anytime, let me know if you're in the area. I'll be happy to show you around. It's Halley 106. Okay, so now, last thing I'll say on this is it is such a privilege to have this lecture carry Art and Mary's name. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Jim Gerstein. Jim Gerstein is a founding partner of GBAO Strategies, a public opinion and research strategy firm, and he has served as a pollster to numerous candidate and independent expenditure campaigns for U.S. Senate, House, and municipal elections. Beyond campaign work, Gerstein has conducted extensive research in a variety of areas, including political beliefs and values, national security and foreign policy, public safety, healthcare, millennials, and American Jews. His work for J Street helped reshape the public understanding of Jewish political attitudes and views toward the U.S. role in the Middle East. I can't think of anyone better situated to help us understand our present moment as we head into this rapidly approaching election. So we are so pleased to have Jim Gerstein deliver our 6th annual Art and Mary Schumann Lecture, Making Sense of the Jewish Vote.
Hi, well, thank you, Bob, for inviting me. It's so great to see everybody here. This is I believe, the fourth time I've been here. Well, third time I've been here, and there was a time on Zoom. If everyone recalls, we had a little interruption of life for a couple of years. But I also would love to thank Decky Alexander for introducing me to Eastern Michigan University and first bringing me here and getting me on the radar of Marty Schichtman, I'm so happy to see you. It's great. And Jeff Bernstein, who I'm just thrilled to be here and see everybody again. So thank you for inviting me and having me. I think we are 36 days from the election. Someone said it's the double high of the of the election period. So what more appropriate time than to talk about the Jewish vote? This is, I've got lots of data, and I know data can be very boring for people, so I've got visuals to make it even more exciting or less boring, however you want to see that. But I'll run through some things to talk about how I've arrived at various conclusions about the Jewish vote and what I'm using to inform others who are working in the political sphere regarding and are interested in attracting Jewish voters and mobilizing Jewish voters and allowing outlets for Jewish voters to participate or engage in this election process. So I'll go through that, and then I would love to open it up for conversation and questions. So let's start with a couple of major takeaways. The first thing I'd say is when I think about the Jewish vote, there's really three basic or core dynamics that drive American Jewish voting behavior. The first and foremost is that Jews are a liberal constituency. They generally hold liberal views on a range of issues. They have a sense of shared political beliefs and values with the Democratic Party. Yeah, we have a very polarized and evenly divided country. So there's two big camps out there. And Jews have been very clear over a long period of time now about which camp they sit in. And when I say Jews or Jewish people or American Jews, I'm not talking about 100%. I'm talking about just the vast majority, and that around 70% in general. And so they're not still making up their minds about what they believe. They have a pretty clear sense of what they believe politically and what their values are, as do most constituencies. And they are firmly in overlap with the Democratic Party. The second piece of this is that there's another party out there, and they are very offended, or they find that party very objectionable. This existed before Donald Trump was on the scene, but I would say he has the feelings are as strong, if not a little bit stronger. He definitely brings out some more passion in voters on both sides, and we do see that with the Jewish vote. Is that while they find Trump objectionable, it also carries over to the party itself, and this isn't a new phenomenon. The third thing is Israel. Israel is constantly in the news. People are talking about it and everything. But it's it's an interesting situation when it comes to actual voting. First of all, I'd say that Jews in the United States have a strong emotional attachment to Israel. Yeah, I don't know if that applies to every single person in this room, but I presume many of you are here because you are engaged in the Jewish community in various ways, and you know how much emotion and attachment there is to the state of Israel, or the country of Israel. But when it comes to voting, for most Jewish voters, it doesn't become the issue that is driving their vote. And that is for a variety of reasons, but at the core of it is that most candidates have to be kind of good enough on Israel so that they feel comfortable and that they are not, and then they can move on to evaluate the candidates on the issues that they're affecting them on a daily basis. I'll show you a list of what they say are the top issues. But the key thing when it comes to Israel is that a candidate is sufficiently credible on the issue. And almost every single candidate that we see running for office, there are exceptions. I'm sure some of you can identify them very quickly, but that almost without exception, they pass that threshold of credibility for a variety of reasons. One, general support. Two, Jewish voters have a very liberal view on the U.S. role in the Middle East in terms of they support Israel. They want to see peace between Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab world. They right now they don't necessarily see that as a realistic thing, but it is an aspirational goal. And when we look at things about in the aftermath of October 7th, they can hold two thoughts in their mind at once. They can feel great sympathy for the atrocities that happened to the Israeli people on October 7th and in other times, but they also can feel sympathy for Palestinians when they see the civilian death and when they're turning on the news and watching. So people can hold two thoughts at once, and it's not incompatible for them. So it is it's what I call a threshold issue. So taken together, I'd say those are the three driving dynamics behind the Jewish vote. But is this going to be the year that the Jewish vote flees the Democratic Party? And because I say, is this going to be the year? Because every 2 years or every 4 years, there's an interview on the street and somebody in South Florida screaming and yelling about how bad Barack Obama is for the Jewish people, how bad Hillary Clinton is, how bad Joe Biden. It is like clockwork. And so but it always will get covered. It will always happen, but that doesn't necessarily represent. However, and what I used to say about Barack Obama was the only problem he has with Jewish voters is that there aren't more of them. And so I think that can be repeated every single cycle. But October 7th does raise a very important question. Is there something different about this election? And yeah, between October 7th, the war in Gaza, rising concerns over anti-Semitism, these are major things that are intervening events between the last election and this election. And it does raise a legitimate question. Is there a new dynamic in the electorate this year that may impact the Jewish vote? And we've looked at this very carefully, and across a lot of data, we, in really probing this and looking, because as pollsters, we want to understand what's really happening so we can provide useful information to our campaigns and our organizations that we work for to help them make sound decisions, data-based decisions. What we've seen is that these events haven't really changed the dynamics behind the Jewish vote. I mean, Donald Trump is still there. The abortion rights, the Supreme Court hasn't suddenly reversed Dobbs. There are lots of things going on this isn't happening in a vacuum, but also the things that we've learned in the research is, first of all, October 7th was incredibly traumatic and painful for Jews around the world and Jews in the United States. And it did, in our data, show that there's been an increase in emotional attachment to Israel, especially in the immediate aftermath. It's sustained itself, but it's starting to come back down a little bit to not quite the levels it was pre-October 7th, but not at the peak that we saw in the early months after the attack. They strongly support President Biden's response to October 7th. Polls we did very shortly after it was, the support was off the charts in terms of his visit to Israel and the speech that he gave there and the aircraft carriers he sent and all the things he was saying and doing definitely resonated very strongly. People supported it strongly. As I mentioned earlier, another dynamic, though, is that they do feel sympathy for both the Israeli and the Palestinian people. That's not to be confused with sympathy for Hamas and Hezbollah, and which I know often gets thrown around and falsely equated with the people that live in Gaza or Lebanon. But they do feel sympathy for both people, though they have a closer connection with the Israeli people. They actually, when Kamala Harris replaced Joe Biden on the ticket, we saw that Jewish voters actually have higher favorable ratings of Kamala Harris than they do Joe Biden, that was actually a surprising finding for me, not because of anything about Kamala Harris, but because Joe Biden was so popular with Jewish voters. And the other thing that we've seen is that they continue to be very opposed to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Finally, on the issue of anti-Semitism, that this isn't the driving issue, but in terms of this discussion of did October 7th and the events after and all the protests and all these things that people are pointing to rising concerns about anti-Semitism, we do see that Jewish voters significantly trust Harris and Democrats more than they trust Trump and Republicans on the issue of who's going to do a better job of fighting anti-Semitism. So all those things together is kind of the story that I see of this election as it relates to the Jewish vote. And I'm going to turn to a lot of data now that kind of provides the findings that lead me to those conclusions. The first being when we look at the political landscape. So as I said at the outset, it's a very liberal Democratic constituency. Here what you'll see is we ask, these are all self-identified. We ask people, how would you characterize yourself, liberal, moderate, or conservative? And you see a plurality say that they're liberal, 44%. This moderate number has actually been rising in the last 2 years to 38%, and only 16% define themselves as conservative politically. I'm not talking Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, but conservative politically, it's only 16%. That is a very small number. In the broader national electorate, it's closer to 35 to 40%, depending on in some states higher, some states a little lower, but this is a very small part of the population. When we look at their how they identify politically, we say, do you consider yourself a Democrat or Republican or something else? This first number here, you can see that by a margin of 63 to the blue and the 16 for red, carefully chosen colors for these bars. It's a net of plus 47. When you take the independents and say, which way do you lean, that grows a little bit to 72% Democratic and 21% Republican. What this tells you is there's really about 7% of the Jewish population is truly pure independent. There's not a lot of swing vote in the Jewish population. When these organizations ask me, what should we be doing to persuade people? There's all this consternation out there. I said, the biggest goal for you if you're a Democratic organization is turnout, because for every Jewish person that goes out to vote, you got a 70+% chance they're going to vote for the Democrat. And when you look at you'll see in a minute, when you look at which Jews, this would be higher if it weren't for the Orthodox population. So it's very easy for you to target your efforts toward the population that's overwhelmingly Democratic. You see some demographics over there on the far right. I hope folks over here can see them okay, but I'll just tell you what it basically says is that it's mostly 2/3 of the Jewish population is either Reform or doesn't have a denomination. So this is a very I once wrote secular. People took issue with the certain term secular because in Israel, I don't know if Amichai is still here. No, I guess not. Yeah. In Israel, you would say chiluni or you're secular. Here, there's Reform, there's conservative, there's no denomination, there's Orthodox. The Orthodox population, which is a very Republican part of the Jewish constituency, is about 9% of the Jewish population. Okay, so. The vote. Everybody wants to know about the vote. So the first thing we do is we ask if the election were today, who would you vote for? And 68% say Kamala Harris, 25% Donald Trump. These darker bars are those who would certainly vote for that candidate. That's why you have the color shading there. But that's if you have in the race 3% for Gerstein, 2% for Cornel West. RFK Jr. is not on here because he's actively trying to get off the ballot in most states. There's some states, but by election day, we presume he won't be on many ballots. If you ask people, imagine it was just two candidates, Harris and Trump. What's noteworthy here is that 68% jumps up to 72 for Kamala Harris, and that 25 for Trump remains at 25. So the multi-party candidates in the Jewish vote are hurting Kamala Harris more than they're hurting Donald Trump, which to me makes sense because this is, as I pointed out, it's a very liberal constituency. Two of the three are very liberal candidates, and so they're getting kind of a disaffected vote. But I think to several others, they're like, oh my God, I've been told that that's a surprising result because they assume that I'm not too sure why they are surprised by it, but I think this is very telling about what the nature of the dynamic is here and where Jews aren't deciding between Harris and Trump as much as these few percent, they're deciding between Harris and just none of the above or a third party candidate. How does this compare? In April of 2024, so about 4 months or 5 months ago, time flies, 5 months ago, when we asked Biden versus Trump, it was 67 to 25. Now it's 72 to 25 in the two-way vote. So this is the first piece of evidence that Kamala Harris has been an improvement among Jewish voters than an already popular and strong Joe Biden. But what I find noteworthy is this plus 41 to plus 47, that 6-point shift, is very consistent with the national shift that we've seen. Biden was generally down about anywhere from 4 to 6 points in national vote, and now Harris is really dead even. And if you want to ask questions later about the other vote, the non-Jewish vote, the other 98% of the country, we can get to that later. But this is a toss-up election. As shocking as that may be to folks, it is a pure toss-up election, but that 6-point shift really is indicative of the shift that we've seen in the national population, and is, I think, speaks to, it's the same degree of shift, it's just starting from a much higher, much stronger position for the Democratic candidate. This is a lot of bars. I just want to highlight a few things about how different constituencies in the Jewish population are voting. As I mentioned earlier, just let's start by looking at the Orthodox. Trump is winning the Orthodox 83 to 17. So the two larger blocks are the Reform and the No Denomination. Those are each at 81%. The conservative, now I'm not talking about ideological, I'm talking about Jewish conservative, is 62-29, a very large gap, but just doesn't look as large when side by side with the Reform and the No Denomination. A couple other things I want to point out here: there is a gender gap in the Jewish population. It's not, Harris is winning 78 to 17, you can see, among women, and 65-33 among men. So yes, Jewish men, we are supporting Kamala Harris, but not at the same rate as Jewish women. But a similar type of gap does exist in the general population. Again, just not with such high margins for the Democrat. Finally, this is noteworthy, is among the younger voters that Harris is doing quite well, 74 to 20 among younger Jewish voters. I'm going to come back to this in a minute because you'll see that they're the voters that are the least motivated to vote. And so there's a high percentage voting for Harris, but less motivated for those that are working in Jewish vote, Jewish outreach. That is an important target, as you'll see. That point I was making earlier about kind of hostility or finding the Republicans objectionable, we capture that in this question, which is a favorability question. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of these candidates? And individuals. So there's, I think, several interesting things here that I want to highlight. The first is the most popular figure among the list of people that we examined is Kamala Harris. She has a 68% favorable rating and a 30% unfavorable rating. If you can see that's higher than Biden's, not much higher, but higher, and that I think again is noteworthy to me. People know who Tim Walz is; they like him. They know who the Democratic Party is, and they like the Democratic Party. I'm going to skip over Netanyahu for a second, go all the way to the red bars on the right, and those are the three figures that we did as Republican proxies, and I'll read the data for those that are straining to see. Let's start with Donald Trump: 23 favorable, 76 unfavorable. It's pretty comparable to where the party is itself, the Republican Party, and where J.D. Vance is. What this tells me, these gray bars down here that have an unfavorable rating of the leaders of the Republican Party in the mid to high 70s, that is why this is not going to be the year that Jews are suddenly going to flee Democrats to Republicans. There is a deep, intense resistance to the Republican Party, its leaders, and you can put other figures in here. Mitch McConnell's unpopular. The Fox News folks are extremely unpopular. Like this is a cultural, they've a deep objection to these figures and the who represent the party. I will mention Netanyahu because we've been tracking this over time, and I think it's fascinating when you look at it through the U.S. political prism. And that is here, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, which as we saw, you'll see in a second how attached Jews are to Israel. You would think the office of the Prime Minister would automatically command a favorable rating. or whoever, regardless of who's holding it. And when we started asking these questions, when he started his second round as prime minister in 2009, we saw that he was very popular. He had basically a plus 20 favorable to unfavorable, plus 25. We started to see that drop at certain moments. The first moment was in 2015 when Netanyahu went to Congress at the invitation of the Republican Speaker of the House to talk about the Iran agreement that President Obama had negotiated with American allies, 5 other allies. And he went to go to the Congress to object to it and try and convince Congress to vote against it. And the reaction among Jewish voters in the United States was, he shouldn't do that. He is making us decide between Obama and him, Obama and Israel, and we're going with Obama. Jews liked President Obama. They thought he was a great president, and they did not like that. So we saw that plus 20, plus 25 come down to about plus 5 and even. So how do you get from there to minus 33 or 33? Yes. How do you get from there to minus 33? And the intervening event between then 2015 and now was Donald Trump. And when they saw the embrace of Trump and Netanyahu, and Trump, as you can see here, is not a favorite of the Jewish electorate, that they were very offended by that. And that there wasn't he's the president, that the prime minister of Israel needs to have good. It was the nature of that embrace that they found so objectionable, especially after the relationship that he had with Obama and the perceived attack on Obama from Netanyahu. So I think I'm talking about it right now, not in terms of like Israeli government policy or anything like that, but purely through the prism of American politics and how they saw the Israeli prime minister engage in that. I don't think there's an objection to the Israeli prime minister engaging in American politics. I think they view him as engaging on the wrong side in this very divided country in which they've chosen a side, the U.S. Jews. Okay, the issue priorities. Remember that third dynamic that I said was when we talk about Israel. So we asked voters, which of the following issues are the 2 most important issues to you when deciding how you'll vote in November? And at the top, you can see, is the future of democracy. This is different than the general population. General population does not prioritize the future of democracy when they're voting. I think this is one of the areas where Joe Biden, who I like very much, was getting it very wrong politically, that he was making his campaign about Charlottesville and democracy and all of that. I think that's not what voters in America are really saying is they're looking for to improve their lives. But it's interesting that the Jewish population does cite that as the top. I think it's a mixture of things, but one of them is I think, as a minority in the country and the history of the Jewish people, that a liberal democracy is very important to part of their feeling of what a country should be and where a type of country they can thrive in. The second most important is abortion. That we see in our polling broadly as a driver in the general population if the Democrats are effective in their campaigns, that will be the decisive issue in the election. But among the Jewish population, it's very high. I would characterize the future of democracy kind of being in a tier on its own, and then you have this second tier of abortion, inflation in the economy are kind of constituting a second tier, and then it starts to drop off, and you can see the range of other issues. You come to Israel. Israel is tied for 9th on a list of 11 issues here at 9%. You can see there's a couple ways of looking at it. So 9% say that is one of their 2 most important issues. 91% say it's not one of their two most important issues. I mean, but this doesn't mean that they don't care about Israel. It just means that when they're thinking about what do they want in their representative or senator or president that is important to them, that's from an issue perspective that is going to determine their vote, it's all these other things. Motivation. This is what we asked people on a 0 to 10 scale. How motivated are you? What's your level of motivation to vote in this November election? And you can see overall it's 9.4 on the scale. That's the mean. That's pretty consistent with what you see the general population right now. But as I mentioned before, if you look at the 18 to 34 audience, it's 8.8. It is significantly lower than any other demographic. So if you recall, 74% of Jewish voters under the age of 35 are voting for the Democrat. They're the least motivated to vote right now. It is for those that are involved in democratic politics and working with the Jewish vote. That is a high priority, is motivating young Jews to vote. But you can see across the board, it's much, it's high across the board. Some of these things should be intuitive, like the oldest age group is the most motivated to vote. They're the most active voters that there are in the electorate. Very quickly, Joe Biden, even though Harris is very popular and more popular, you can see Biden has a 68% job approval rating among Jewish voters. I point this out as a way of saying, in the context of his overall job approval with the general population is in the low 40s, about 40, 41, up from the mid to high 30s when he was running, but he got that bump for stepping out. That gap between this 68% and let's just say 41% nationally, it's a 27-point gap. That has been consistent throughout. Whenever we've gone into the field with the Jewish survey, I've said to our clients, I said, well, it looks like Joe Biden today is a 35% job approval. I'm going to predict that it's going to be about 62% in with our Jewish survey, and lo and behold, it's going to be around there. That margin is larger than what we saw when Barack Obama, the gap between the Jewish and the general population. Obama's was about a 15 to 20 point gap. Here it's about it's high 20s. So not a knock on Obama. I think it's more about an even stronger sense about Joe Biden. Okay, Israel. So I've been referring multiple times about how Jews in America are attached to Israel. We asked the question, this is a question we got from Pew Research. They asked this question as well. How emotionally attached are you to Israel? A total of 75% say that they are emotionally attached to Israel, including 43% who say they are very attached. Okay. This number after October 7th was it was about 82, 83% attached. So before October 7th, it was around 70%. So I mentioned it had peaked and it's come down a little, but it's still higher than what it was before October 7th. There's a strong emotional attachment to Israel. So whenever I point out that it's the low priority voting issue, doesn't mean that Jews don't care about Israel. They do. And you have to pass that threshold of credibility. But earlier I was talking about how Jews are they're a liberal constituency in general, but they have I think people would characterize as a liberal view on the America's approach to Israel. We get at this in a few different ways. In this survey, what we asked is, do you think someone can be critical of Israeli government policies and still be pro-Israel? 92% of Jews say yes. We are a kvetching population. But I think that speaks very well to our population, that you can be critical of the policy of a government just as you can be critical of American policy and still be a patriotic American. These things shouldn't be inconsistent. I know that I love this question because I think it kind of puts a spotlight on some of the silliness of the conversation, that you can't be critical of an and still love Israel. That's just not where people are. And but we did another question here because maybe it's different when it comes to the war. Maybe and this goes back to is October 7th and the war and anti-Semitism, is that going to change the dynamic in this election? Well, here we get at it indirectly. We say, so half the sample got this question about critical of Israeli government policies. And this other question over here was, the other half of the sample said, can someone be critical of how Israel is conducting the war with Hamas and still be pro-Israel? That's a harder thing to say yes to, yet 83% still say yes. Okay, so the people who peel off, by the way, the difference between these people this 92 and that 83, or I guess better, the difference between the 8% and 70% is driven by the Orthodox population. The Orthodox population is fine criticizing Israeli government policy, especially it's policy that they don't like, right? but they're much less comfortable with criticism of conducting the war, which I thought was interesting. We, in this survey, this is small print, I'll read the exact question to you because it speaks to how Biden and Kamala Harris may be perceived and how the administration is dealing with Israel. Now I should say, this survey that I'm pointing to was finished September 1st. This was before all the stuff that's been going on with Hezbollah and Lebanon, but still very timely in terms of the situation in Gaza. He says, as you may know, President Biden and Vice President Harris are working with negotiators to reach an agreement that releases all Israeli hostages held by Hamas and achieves a ceasefire in Gaza. Do you support or oppose Biden's and Harris's efforts to reach an agreement for release of hostages and a ceasefire? Now, we tried to write this in a very balanced way, okay? We aren't saying, do you support their efforts for releasing the hostages? We don't say, do you support their efforts to reach a ceasefire? We say what they are actually saying. They are saying we must have a ceasefire, we must have a full release of the hostages. That's the deal. That is what we were trying to negotiate with the Qataris and the Egyptians and Hamas. 87% say that they support that agreement, their efforts for that agreement, including 66% who say they strongly support it. You can see this is on the far right here, you can see this broken down by the different demographics within the Jewish population, and it's very strong across age, across gender, across denomination, with the exception of the Orthodox, where there's not as high a level of support for their efforts. I think that is seen through the partisan lens more than anything. But regardless, you can see the results here. But we then ask, well, remember, 87% support this. We say, do the Biden-Harris administration's policies toward the Israel-Hamas war make you more or less likely to vote for Kamala Harris, or does it make no difference? And the largest number, the plurality, is no difference, 40%. So they support it. It's just not pushing them. They're focused on their things. Now, to the extent that it does, 36% say more likely that their policies towards the Israel-Hamas war makes them more likely to vote for Harris, and 24% say less likely to vote for Harris. That will break down a little bit by the partisan lines within the Jewish population. So I thought that was also an interesting finding. Finally, I'm actually going to, in the interest of getting questions, I'm going to skip over this really long thing. The bottom line was we pitted Trump's message against Kamala Harris, which says how wonderful he was as a president, for Israel's biggest supporter, attacks Kamala Harris for not choosing Governor Josh Shapiro as a running mate because he's a strong supporter of Israel, kind of the litany of things. It doesn't get into some of the things that some people would consider anti-Semitic that he's been saying about Jews. We don't get at that in this question. This is really what he is saying is why to vote for him. And half the sample got something that was a domestic-driven message from Kamala Harris and one that was a Israeli-centric message, and they perform about the same. I mean, the domestic-based message actually performs a little bit better, which is particularly striking because the attack on her is an Israeli-based attack, more or less. Again, I don't want to get into, if folks find this interesting, we can come back and ask about it later. I just don't want to, it's a long and deep question. I don't want to get too much sidetracked by it right now. Because I want to get to the last thing that we asked about in this survey that kind of rounds out the picture on things that would be uniquely relevant to the Jewish population in this vote. And we asked people, how concerned are you about anti-Semitism in the United States? 91% said they are concerned about it, including 66% who say that they are very concerned. That is a really high number, and you have near, universal agreement by demographic. I would note among the under 35s, they're the ones that are the least, they're not as concerned. I mean, 80% concern is a very high number, but it's not as high as the older generations. We, in previous research, did some things about how serious of a problem you think these different things are in the United States and how on campuses. And we did anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism to see the comparison between those things relative to each other and the comparison to those things by age group. And what was fascinating was, I'm sorry I don't have the visual for you on this, but the younger voters on campus said that anti-Semitism on campus was a much smaller problem than the older voters. And when I was presenting that to the organization, and all these people with the same color hair that I have were saying, how can it be that these kids don't, what is wrong with them? And I said, my experience has been that Jewish parents are a little more worried about their kids than the Jewish kids are worried about themselves. But they also just don't, I think they're living, the more serious answer is that they come from a very diverse generation. They are exposed to people in their social life, in their daily life, that their parents and grandparents certainly were not exposed to, and they have a different, broader view. They also have been raised in an era in which, and I am not equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, but because that's part of this dynamic and discussion right now, they have been raised in a period where the 1967, where Israel has not been a victim. And if anything, when they view Israel, they see Israel as occupying the West Bank and the things with the mistreatment of Palestinians and a very far right government in Israel, and that's how they're interpreting news about Israel. So that's very different than anti-Semitism. But I'm just speaking to there is a difference among young people and older generations in their lived experience. That is something I think that Jewish organizations in particular should be paying very close attention to, and how they talk and work with younger voters to understand, younger Jewish people, understand what their different experience is. So, two other questions on anti-Semitism, then we'll go to questions. We ask, who do you trust more to fight anti-Semitism? I think I referenced this in the opening remarks. You can see here Kamala Harris, 60% of Jews trust her more to fight anti-Semitism compared to 23% who trust Trump more. The rest are both or neither. I think ideally you would see a high both number, that they would feel that everybody's fighting it, but that it doesn't. This breaks down very differently, and you see Democrats or Republicans, the gap is not quite as large as it is between Harris and Trump, but it's still quite large, of 54 to 26. The last question, again, because the anti-Semitism topic is so much in the news and discussed so much, and one of the presidential candidates out there is saying some pretty awful things. If you haven't guessed, I work for the Democrats. But we aren't making this up. We're asking, as you may know, Donald Trump recently said that any Jewish person that votes for Democrats hates their religion. They hate everything about Israel, and they should be ashamed of themselves because Israel be destroyed. Again, I am not making this up. And there's other things. We didn't know which quote to put into the survey because of the litany of things that he has said that are really so foul and dangerous and really horrible. So the first thing we asked was, do you agree or disagree with Trump's statement? We're not asking that to be cute, but there's a process to this. It's a two-stage question. First, 20% agree with that statement. There are people who share that view. But 80%, the vast majority, it turns out, don't want to be told that they hate their religion. And so 80% say they disagree. Among those who disagree, but now here's the meat of the question. Do you believe Trump's statement is anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic? So it's not, is he coddling the anti-Semites? It's is his statement anti-Semitic? And you can see among the 80% who said they disagree with it, 84% said they believe that is anti-Semitic. And again, I think that's a good way to kind of bring it back together at the end and say, is there a different dynamic this year that's going to change the way Jews have historically voted? And I think when you have things like this, but also that hostility to the party itself, that is extremely difficult to make inroads until those things change. And there's nothing really going on in the Republican Party that's leading to the sorts of changes that would make Jews give them a new look. So I'm going to wrap it up there and say I would love to take any questions that folks have.
And very, very quickly. Unfortunately, I thought there was an additional microphone. There
Oh.
does not seem to be, so if we can speak up.
I'll just call on folks as I see them. Okay, yes, sir.
I have a question. Could you describe the population that the surveys were given to? Is this across the United States or?
Yes.
I didn't get a sense.
Yeah, sorry. In the interest of time, I skipped the traditional methodology. First of all, this was a national survey of Jews who identify as Jewish. Yeah, we used, I don't know how much folks are familiar with Pew Research. They are one of these, more traditional academic, very well-funded endowments that does serious research across a range of things. One of the things they do every several years is a very extensive Jewish study. So what we do is we use the same question wording that they do, which was developed by a committee of academics involved in these things. We use their question of how they screen for whether or not somebody's Jewish, and the questions they ask to go through. And we also use their demographics when they say, I showed you the slide that 9% of the Jewish population identifies as Orthodox and 37% is Reform. We're weighting the data that we have to those Pew results because that's the best known data we have to make sure that we're getting now I can say that the way we collect the data is from we take a voter file, a national voter file. I hope this isn't news to you, but whether or not you voted in an election is public information. And it's a transparency thing in a democracy. And you have, there are voter files, and our company, we do this for all our polls that we do. We purchase a voter file for that, in this case, it was a national file. And on there are there's what we call models of whether or not someone is likely to be Jewish. And it's based on a variety of factors, the most important one being name, not just last name, but first name. So, and it errs on the side of too inclusive so that you can get as many people and then see if they screen, when you ask them, and if they screen in, if they truly identify as Jewish. So there might be a Jack Smith who is on there who is Jewish and will rescreen in, and one who does not. And then there's other things. So we go through, that's how we collect the data. In this, what we've moved to methodologically also in the last 4 years for our Jewish surveys is you get a text, because we have their phone numbers, you get a text, and then you click on a link to take the survey on your phone, or if you did it by a computer, you can do it by computer. These are not phone calls, in fact, because it's such a small population, it's very hard to reach. But you would think, oh, maybe you're not getting enough older people. Turns out that we're getting too many older people in the surveys, and we have to weight them down. Okay, yes?
I have a question about the undecided voters, which I'm not asking you to help me understand it because it just makes no sense. Undecided, but can you help me understand whether the percentage of undecideds in the Jewish vote is roughly the same as the general population, and what are some similarities and differences?
It's a great question. I think you can see here it's 3% and 4% undecided in this particular survey at this stage of the election cycle. This is low number of undecided. It's a little lower than what you would see in outside of the Jewish population. But remember, it is a base constituency for, you'll see much higher undecideds among swing voters. So many of your fellow Michiganders, this is you may have noticed, it's a swing state, and you'll have a higher number of undecideds here, particularly with certain demographic groups that are more swingy. The biggest one being independents. If you ask people, are you Democrat, Republican, or independent? Those who say independent, their undecided is significantly higher. So those are who your undecideds are. There's fewer independents in the Jewish population.
That's all. Okay. Thank you.
Marty, should we let Marty ask a question?
It's going to be a peculiar one, too.
Okay.
So,
Do you want to come up?
as you said, we're a very small part of the population. And yet both Trump and Harris, I mean, have really gone on record courting the Jewish vote. Well, I mean, Trump does it in his own awkward way, but they're both courting the Jewish vote. I mean, if either one of them said, we will stop sending arms to Israel, they would give themselves greater access to an extra 100,000 votes in the state of Michigan. But they couldn't know that. And yet both have been serious about courting the Jewish vote. So I guess and since most of that tiny sliver of population don't even live in swing states, I mean, they tend to live on East and West Coasts. Why do we matter?
That's a good question, Marty. I think there's a variety of answers I can provide. And one I would say is, in an extremely close election, everything matters. And now, of the list of things that matter, it's going to be lower compared to, if you're looking at demographics in the state of Michigan, certainly turning out black voters, or persuading voters in the Grand Rapids media market, right? It's a swingy area. Shrinking your margin of loss in northern Michigan. There's a bunch of things that you can go through. And by the way, the single most important thing that Democrats should be doing in the state of Michigan is trying to make sure that people go in to vote thinking about abortion rights. That is the biggest advantage, and that is why the 2022 election was not the red wave that should have happened with an unpopular incumbent president. It's why Democrats have been winning special elections, in whether it's a Supreme Court race in Wisconsin in 2023, or even in Alabama, where it was a state rep race that we should have lost by, like 50 points. It was like 7. There's just all this evidence that the Dobbs decision really transformed the election. So that's much higher. I will also say, and if you're watching the Senate commercials, you'll see Lissa Slotkin talking very tough about border security. It's extremely important for Democratic candidates to be seen as credible on the border, so that voters pass that threshold of credibility on that issue, and voters say, I'm not going to let a minor disagreement that I might have on their policy there, as opposed to a major disagreement with their policy there. They will be then able to turn again to issues like abortion rights. So why are they courting? I think you could say one of it is everything matters, and they have lots of money in these campaigns to do lots of different things. I think that Kamala Harris's positions that she takes on Israel and the war, and as well as Palestinian civilian life, I think they come from what she believes in, and that she's going to talk, and she's demonstrating her national security and foreign policy chops when she talks about these things, and Ukraine and China and Iran and Russia. So I think that it's more than just necessarily a political decision, but what she wants to demonstrate about herself and what she believes in. I'm not going to venture to guess what goes on with Trump and his. I know, it is a very bizarre strategy that he would be employing right now on that. So, okay, well, here and then here. Yes.
Piggybacking on
Okay.
Marty's comments, I remember 4 years ago when you spoke, and I remember in essence, and correct me if I'm wrong, that at that time the Jewish vote was not significant, and there was only one. I could be wrong. One congressional district somewhere in New York that the Jewish vote mattered.
I can see myself saying something along those lines, but
Is that still the case?
I'd say there are certain congressional districts where there's greater Jewish population. I get the sense there's a lot of political junkies in the room. So you may have heard of Tom Suozzi. You certainly have heard of George Santos. George Santos was the member of Congress from New York's 3rd Congressional District. He had to resign, and Tom Suozzi was the Democrat running against someone named Mazi Philip, who served in the IDF, but, you know, it was an American citizen and was, you know, I think and that district has a lot of Jewish voters in it. I want to say it's somewhere in the 10% range, maybe a little bit more, and there's a couple of districts that have up to 15%. And, you know, so on paper, they looked at her and said, she's great. And Tom Suozzi actually had been the congressman previously. He stepped down to run unsuccessfully for governor and wanted to run for reelection. Transparency, he's a client of ours. His strategy to win that race was to pass a threshold of credibility on immigration and to point out her position on abortion rights. And it was a very effective strategy, and he won actually, I want to say by 8 points. It's went in an election that should have been like 1 or 2 points. He paid close attention to Jewish voters there. I would say that the position he adopted was kind of a very strong support of Israel in its response to October 7th, a little bit, but not much emphasis on, getting to a resolution and concern for the Palestinian civilian population being affected. So anyway, yes, it matters more in certain areas than others, but at the end of the day, yes, it's going to be about 2 or 3% of most swing states, sometimes a little bit more. Pennsylvania may be 3.5%, but Wisconsin is really small Jewish population. So, okay, yes, please.
Thanks so much for this. So I would want to pick up on something you were saying right towards the end about the younger Jewish vote and how you thought it would behoove people to pay attention to the lived experience of the 18 to 35 crowd and why there might be something changing. I'm not under 35, but I'm not that far away. And I, to put my cards on the table, I've been among a minority, but not insignificant, I don't think, of Jewish people who are, have been extremely critical of Israel for a long time, since we're teenagers, and would like the US to stop sending weapons to Israel, and I could keep talking, but I won't. But I'd say I'm more like a lot of some of the college students I'm seeing around than not. It's really hard for me to see in this data that more kind of left position, or like whatever you want to label it as, because I'm certainly going to vote for Kamala Harris, but I'm not happy about it. I'm not happy about her or Biden and how they've acted since October 7th. But of course I'm going to vote for them because I certainly would never vote for Trump and all the other issues. But then I don't know how to find myself in there and how to know what's going on generally, not just for myself, but just trying to figure out what young Jewish people are doing too, because it does seem like there's a generational shift, but that's so anecdotal. That's so much just stuff I observe and read, a few things I'm reading, but like not finding great statistics and wondering how it's being studied, and both because I'm interested in what the numbers actually are, and I know it's a small minority of a small minority, and because I want to figure out how to have more influence on Democrats.
Sure. I have lots of other slides that are not in this deck from other research that we've done, and one of the questions that we've asked was, do you think the United States is doing too much, too little, or the right amount in supporting Israel after October 7th? We actually did the same thing about the Palestinian, it wasn't Israel, the Israeli people, because we then asked also, do you think the United States is doing the too much, too little, or the right amount to support the Palestinian people? And I would say that maybe you're over 35, but you are in line with people under 35 in terms of how they responded to that question, where you actually had, among younger Jews under the age of 35, felt that the U.S. was supporting Israel too much. Not by a huge margin, and it was very different than the other age groups. And that was, so it's a little bit more than anecdotal. I mean, it's not massive in terms of too much versus too little, but it is a plurality saying too much compared to too little. So there is something, but notably, they also had a very high attachment to Israel, and they were still voting overwhelmingly for Biden. This was asked during when Biden was running. So that tells me, it reiterates a lot of the things I was saying, and that is people can feel attached to Israel. They can be critical of U.S. policy being too supportive or not supportive enough, but they can hold these thoughts at the same time. And to pick on you, you're holding multiple thoughts about you're not going to vote for Trump because of other things, right? And it leads you to Harris. Now, when I say I don't think Kamala Harris is taking anyone's vote for granted, but I think that those are the different dynamics that are come into play when you're talking about somebody's able to be critical, not happy about it in either direction, but they're not so egregiously bad to them that they're going to say, nothing is worse than this, and I don't care if Trump's president. They say, no, okay, I want them to act differently, but I'm still going to vote for this person because of other things that are important to me. Jeff?
Could you head to the slide at the end where you saw the different ways that people thought about candidates with anti-Semitism?
Yes.
Yeah, this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts a little bit on how Kamala Harris on this slide is sort of more liked than the generic Democrat, and it sort of seemed a theme that has gone through, that Jewish voters seem to like the Democrats, and they really kind of like Harris a little bit more than the average Democrat. And I'm wondering if you agree with my perception of your data and if you have thoughts on it.
I mean, you're accurate for sure. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. We don't have other questions in here that would help me definitively answer that. However, I would say that in general, you saw that for a constituency, that's a base constituency for a particular party, it is not unusual to see that the head of that party has a higher favorability, as you saw Harris having for the party itself. Because it's a singular person. Party's a coalition, right? The party is it's an amalgamation of a lot of different people, and people can identify with it however they want. But I think when you have an individual, and it's an individual of a party that you like, or that you identify with, that to me, it makes some intuitive sense that it would be higher, whether that's on the favorability or other measures that you're going to see on. I'm sure if we had something about the economy, Harris would be stronger than the Democratic Party, just because of the known entity. That's my theory or conjecture. I don't have data to directly answer. Hi.
I have a theory about the super progressive left Democrats sort of abandoning us partners in social justice work after October 7th. I mean, there's now a lot of us that would have previously called ourselves very progressive liberal Democrats, but we were completely abandoned by people we considered allies. So there could be some suspicion now of the party overall.
I think it's an interesting theory, and where I would resist it is I don't necessarily think that the people answering this question are saying that those progressives are Democrats. When you're saying who's doing a better job, the Democrats or who do you trust more, Democrats or Republicans? They're not saying who do you trust more, liberals or progressives or conservative. So I think there's a distinction there, and I come to that because it does frustrate me to no end when I see things that Democratic elected officials are not saying, but quote progressives or however you want to label it are saying, that then get attributed to Democratic elected officials, and it's just not. Like, for example, defund the police. There weren't Democratic candidates running around. I mean, there may be a couple out there, but generally, to say that the Democratic Party was for defunding the police is completely inaccurate. In fact, you have candidates now going out of their way to say that, now, that's different than saying we have a public safety crisis that involves that where there is police brutality that needs to be rooted out and addressed. I mean, that certainly is a problem, but that's very different than a defund the police. And I think that could be the gap between what progressives are saying, what Democratic candidates are saying, and elected officials.
Time for one more question.
Okay, sure.
It's more of a statement than anything else. That age group 18 to 35, we've noticed this as well. Where they get their source of information from, where they get their news from is completely different to our group.
Our son is terrible.
Do we have a screen time problem in your house?
Stop looking at Reddit.
So I think that may be part of the problem, because they look on their phone for an answer or something, or question, and you've got to question the source of that information. And that's where you might be losing that demographic as well, because of that same reason that I see.
I mean, there's a lot of discussion and evidence that I would point to a phenomenon that is very well documented or clear, and that is the influence of Fox News. Now, that's not on the Jewish population, but, in terms of misinformation and, why do we have
Recently, the whole group of those people that were arrested because they were getting money from Putin to put false information on there, because they're YouTube followers and they have vast numbers of followers, and they're all in that younger generation. And they think that's the truth sometimes. And I heard someone, like, the son say something the other day, and I'm like, well, that sounds a little weird. And I waited until the next day, it was completely false.
Yeah.
And that's huge. And I'm sure that happens all the time.
Okay. Thank you for hosting me. I love it here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.